I set myself on fire. It was a self-inflicted thing, and I struggled with not only the physical aspect of that, but the psychological aspect of that, and I wasn't given any help for that. After the incident happened, I've kind of always felt like, well, because it's my own fault, because I did it myself, I can't possibly ask for help with that. A lot of internalized stigma that I carry around whole aspects of myself, like healthcare professionals as well. Probably the main group, really, to be honest, of kind of blaming me has been healthcare professional. But I've experienced things like I can remember a period in time where Instagram would take down my selfies because or photos with my face in it because it was unsuitable for, like, it goes against community guidelines or whatever it says. It was just such a turning point, like that weekend, and that burn survivor community accepting me and accepting what I'd done started the process of me accepting what I'd done, and to be able to move forward from something, the first thing you need to do is accept it's happened, and that was a huge turning point in my life. A lot of what affects people with visible difference is that people are scared of visible difference, and the more we tell our stories, the less scared people become.
Welcome to the Life with a Difference podcast, a platform to amplify the voices of those living with a visible difference, and also to provide relevant information from industry leaders and experts. Right, we're sorted. Look at that.
Right,
well done.
We're rolling.
You'll start raining now, just watch in 2 seconds.
Yeah, probably.
Do you mind introducing yourself and explaining a little bit about your visible difference, please?
My name's Ellie, 37, from Sheffield. I have a very long history of mental health problems. I have complex PTSD and an eating disorder, and I previously had the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. And over the years, I've struggled with self-harm, and so that is kind of what has led to my visible differences. I've got a lot of scars all over my body, but especially including my face, which obviously is not something that you can hide away that easily. So yeah, that's how I came about having a visible difference. So slightly different to some people. Some might say it's a choice. It's not a choice to have gone through what I've gone through and end up coping in the way I do. It's taken me a long time to accept my scars in any way, but I'm kind of on the journey of getting there.
Thank you for that. I think it's really important to say that right off the bat. In terms of dispelling this myth of choice, I think that's a archaic way of looking at things, and a very small way in that I could potentially relate to that is that, so I have atopic dermatitis, which is always going up and down, and when it's bad, the damage I can do with just my fingernails is crazy. I will literally tear my skin to pieces. You're talking blood dripping down my body as I'm scratching myself and unable to stop. And people have said, people insinuate that that's a choice. It absolutely isn't. And so same thing for you. If you had the choice, I don't believe you would have potentially done that.
I guess like yours is a physical itch that you've had, and mine, I guess, is a mental itch. Like that you can't. There comes a point when you can't avoid it anymore, and it's not really a choice.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I totally agree. And so, have you encountered that quite a lot? That attitude from people that it's in air quotes self-inflicted, therefore it's almost your fault. And I guess, have you experienced victim blaming in that sense?
Yeah, 100%. I've experienced that from like all areas, whether that be from strangers on the street, people I know. And also like healthcare professionals as well. Probably the main group, really, to be honest, of kind of blaming me has been healthcare professionals. And I think things are changing. I think there's been a lot of improvement with people's understanding of mental illness in general and self-harm. Yeah, I've been, I've had wounds refused to be sutured. Doctors have refused to suture wounds because I did it myself, when that wound would not be left unsutured. Like, that's stitched up for anyone who doesn't know the word sutured. Like, that wouldn't happen to anyone else with a wound like that. It doesn't really matter how it's happened; it still does need treating in the same way. So I had a really difficult situation with a wound on a very kind of complex wound on my face, that a doctor refused to suture because he said, "Oh, you've got plenty of scars. One more won't matter," and that's not his choice to make. He made no effort to understand where I was and how I'd got to the point that I did. He just saw a person with lots of scars that were self-inflicted and presumed that was fine. It's fine.
Unbelievable to hear that. It really is just, I think a lot of people in the visible difference community have had, unfortunately, these negative experiences with healthcare providers. But examples like that are just so shocking to hear. I don't understand that mindset as someone whose job it is to care for people,
Mm.
to essentially turn someone away that needs care. Did you put in a complaint or anything like that, or did you?
Yeah, I did actually, because he also was like, you need to be engaging with the self-harm interventions offered to you and stuff like that. We don't have any self-harm interventions in our city. I don't think many cities do. It's not for the want of trying. And yeah, there were several other things that happened around that situation that warranted a complaint, and I did complain actually a while later when I'd kind of had time to sit on it. And I had a really, really good response from the hospital trust that it was under. I was invited in to speak to the consultant that was above this doctor, who was a registrar, who was incredibly apologetic, like as if he'd accidentally said something himself, sort of thing. Like, he really, really did take it. He was really apologetic, and he identified that one of the areas that they needed to improve on was in educating their junior doctors. And so I actually work uh, in the NHS as a lived experience educator and researcher. So I was like, well, I'm happy to help with that. If that helped, like, I'm happy to help. So that was one of the ways we moved forward. And an interesting one, which I've never, ever, ever heard of anybody else who's self-harmed being offered this, is that they offered me laser scar revision uh, surgery if I wanted it on that scar, which is something that I'm umming and ahhing about, and I actually have made a lot more peace with my scars on my face. I might not actually take that up, but so they responded very well to the complaint, and both in terms of, like, yeah, we've got an education deficit here. Um,
Well, that's really positive. I mean, well handled for sure. I mean, that's great. And there's always that initial urge when something like that happens to kind of get the pitchforks out and, go kick some doors down. But
mm,
again, yeah, well handled in that it turned into a sort of positive thing in the end, because that must take some emotional strength
yeah,
to
hence
not
why I
just want to.
waited. I
Yeah,
waited a
good
while.
move. Yeah, very
Yeah.
good move. Yeah, fair enough. To kind of get into sort of the tough conversation. And again, please, if you're say as much or as little as you're comfortable saying, in terms of your visible difference, your facial visible difference, that was it with alkaline chemicals, I believe, and would you? And this may be an impossible question, but are you able to in any way share kind of the mental place you were in at that moment to do that?
Yeah. So I mean, I've got scars all across my body. Most are cutting scars, but I have had issues with burning myself. I have scars from an incident where I set myself on fire in 2015, and that left me with a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder around fire, around various other aspects connected to that. And it, that alongside my self-harm being more of a compulsive nature. So a lot of people presume that self-harm is a very sort of like, someone will have like an intense emotion and just kind of lose it and cut themselves or whatever that is. That is the case for some people and has in the past been the case for me, but my self-harm is more along the kind of obsessive compulsive lines of things. So I will build a kind of image, an idea of a self-harm thing in my head, and that will kind of like grow and grow and grow, and I can ignore that for like months and years now. I didn't used to be able to, but I've done a lot of work on that. And one of the sort of things that I had been a really kind of clear need to, and I can't explain where these things come from, where they originate, but they kind of like materialize in my head, and I'll push them away, push them away, push away until it becomes too much. And I had this very clear like need in my mind of creating a burn on the right hand side of my face, like the shape of it, what it needed to look like. I think some of that stemmed from the 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 fire and kind of that not having happened in the fire, and for whatever reason my brain needed that to happen, and I sat on that urge for 7 years. So I've been living with that for 7 years, and a variety of things have like happened on the lead up to me actually choosing to do that. Have a lot of my facial self-harm is around unwanted interest from a certain individual, who actually now has like the police has been involved, there is a restraining order in place. That's part of it, but also like a variety of other things can add up to it, and it actually came not that long after the incident that I've just mentioned with the suturing. Not the doctor not wanting to suture, it wasn't that long afterwards, and I kind of just got to the point where that compulsion was so big, so all consuming. Like you were talking about your itches, you just can't think of anything else, you can't see anything else, that's all that that is in your life at that moment. And that compulsion had got to that point 7 years after the start of it happening, and I did act on it. I was not in a I wasn't massively in a dark place at that moment. It's quite hard to explain. I'd been in dark places, and that's what got me to that moment. But actually it was quite a well thought out thing at the time, if that makes sense. I had spoken to the mental health team about it. They knew it was going to happen. I'm someone who it's not always helpful to prevent self-harm, because sometimes I can do a lot of damage in other ways if I'm prevented from doing a certain thing that actually I know what I'm doing. So it was a bizarre situation actually, that I was almost supported through that happening. Not that they were permitting that to happen. They were like, if you want to not do it, like, we want to help you not do it as well. But also understanding that sometimes these things just they're are really hard to not act on. So yeah, I did act on it, and it was a significant injury that's led me to have need skin graft surgery and obviously treatment from the burns team. But it also has been a massive turning point for me, because I was supported through that, as opposed to it being avoided talking about. Actually, I was able to process those feelings and those things that get me to that point, that get me to the point of hating my face so much that I might damage it, and all of that. And actually, from that point, I've turned a massive corner in starting to care for myself, starting to care for my face, and starting to accept my scars as well. Before I wouldn't accept them, and I am starting to accept that they are part of me, and have not actually self-harmed like since then. So
Thank you so
it
much.
sounds weird, but it was actually a moving forward point in my life.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for going into so much detail. That's really insightful, and yeah, helps to. I'd like to think if anyone heard that, they'd be able to have a bit more empathy for the situation and
Mm.
understand that, as you say, it comes. As you said, you sat on it for 8 years trying to fight that compulsion. That shows just how strong and all-consuming that compulsion must have been. Um, was it? Was it? Sorry, this it's a very personal question again, but do you believe that there is something? There's a root cause for all of your mental health issues, or is it a mix of lots of different things over your life? Would you say?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of lots of different things. I
Hmm.
think um, I've had a lot of things happen to me in my life that obviously have led to me being destabilized and like traumatic things that have led to PTSD. However, and there's this whole sort of like, is it kind of like something to do with your genes, all of that sort of type of argument that's going on. And I'm actually the only person in my family with mental health problems, like, so it's definitely not a genetic thing. But one of the things that has kind of made me be confused for quite a lot of years until recently has been wondering how some of the things that have happened to me in my life left me so traumatized and so unable to cope. Whereas like that some people can cope with that, like some people do manage to cope with those things. um uh, and like why was that? Why for years I was kind of beating myself up for being, I guess, a weak person and not coping with that. But more recently I've come to realize that I'm probably not neurotypical. Yeah, I realize that I'm probably neurodiverse. I need a lot of routine in my life. I struggle with change. I struggle with being overstimulated. All of those sort of things that might make experiences that I've had more difficult for me to experience. And that's been another thing that in the last couple of years I've become to sort of start to accept a little more. That Yeah, a lot of stuff has happened in my life, but also um that for me in particular, and the way my brain works is it has been particularly difficult. So it's kind of a combination of a lot of things.
So when I'm having a particularly crazy scratching session, and I've got various scars over my body from some particularly bad ones, I would get I'd get a few seconds of like pure bliss satisfaction,
Mm.
and then immediately followed by mega guilt and more pain. Was yours similar to that? Did you get that sort of moment of satisfaction by doing
Yeah,
that?
100%. And I think this is something that people find quite difficult to understand. Like I this is gonna sound really weird. Please don't judge me for it, but I enjoy self-harm because I do get that high from it. Um I get the high from achieving something that I'd set out to achieve. And yeah, I definitely do get that feeling. Unfortunately, that feeling doesn't last. And then that's when it kind of comes crashing back down. And yeah, like you were saying, there's guilt. There's like, should I have done this, or this is going to affect other people? There's a whole host of negative things that come after that. But yeah, straight after the actual act, I am somewhat, yeah, have some form
Relieved
of high
almost.
relief. Yeah.
Yeah.
um yeah, it's a
Yeah, thank you.
complicated thing for, I think, for people who don't go through those sort of things to understand
No,
how.
I appreciate your honesty with that.
Yeah.
No, I can totally understand where that comes from. I think a lot of the negative, often addictive behaviours are probably the same thing. Whether it's
Mm,
from gambling to alcohol, you're chasing those few seconds of relief and satisfaction, but
yeah,
unfortunately,
exactly.
on the whole, it's a negative. But those few seconds are just so intoxicating, aren't they? That
Yeah,
yeah.
it's exactly the same mechanism. Yeah,
Mm.
of gambling, drugs, alcohol. Like it's all the same thing. It's just
Mhm.
we kind of everybody's got their different ways of choosing
Yeah, yeah.
to get that high. And
Okay. Yeah, okay. And with your visible difference, did you note? Uh, so I kind of get to see both sides of the coin a little bit. So, like for example, today my skin's pretty good, and so I go out into the world and I'm fairly, seen as fairly normal. But then other days my skin is horrendous, and I very much notice a difference in how I'm treated. Did you notice a significant difference before and after your visible difference?
Yeah, so I guess I've also probably got a different experience as a lot of people with a physical difference, in that mine has kind of, I guess, built up gradually over the years. Like, I wasn't born with it, and I also didn't have an incident that meant it happened quite fairly suddenly. It has been something that's grown over the years. So initially, as is quite common for people who self-harm, my self-harm was on my arms and my legs, and I could cover those up fairly easily. And I did do for many years, because not necessarily because I'd experienced stigma, but because I'd heard of other people experiencing stigma, and also felt that it wasn't appropriate to show scars. I wasn't allowed to show scars, so I covered them up for many, many years. So I actually didn't experience any uh, adverse sort of effects of having not effects, because I had to cover my arms up, but I wasn't experiencing reactions from other people for many years. And then I did start to wear bare sleeves and have my scars on my legs on show. And um I and I do remember initially I'd get people shouting across the street with my legs in particular, like, "Oh, have you been in an accident?" Like, all this sort of stuff, which was just like, it's totally inappropriate. If I had been in an accident, I'm not going to shout it back across the street to
Mm,
you.
hmm.
It was kind of, it wasn't necessarily judgment. People didn't know what it was, especially if self-harm scars aren't in like horizontal lines on your wrist. People don't tend to think they're self-harm scars. So, but it surprised me how much people would shout other things. Have you been in an accident? Have you been in a fight? All of these sort of things. Um, um, yeah, that people would shout. But I kind of got to the point where I was like, I was kind of okay with that. My scars had faded, but then over the years, obviously my scarring has, like, I have scarring on my face, and that's sort of uh kind of built up. And that's been a more difficult one, because when I'm in a conversation with someone and I can see them, you can sometimes see them avoiding looking at your arms and legs, but you can still have eye contact and have that conversation with them. It's fine. But with facial scars, when people are trying to avoid looking at your face and you're having a conversation with them, it's really awkward and really obvious. And I've gone through different experiences with how I've managed that. Some being that I just cut down the conversation and walk away, that it was too uncomfortable. But as I got a little bit more self-aware, I guess sometimes I'd be like, I can see you're having trouble looking at my face. I have scars on my face. It's okay for you to look at them. um, and that sometimes would break the ice, because people felt like they couldn't be looking at the scars. But you
Hmm.
need to look at someone's face if you're having a conversation with them. That's a normal
Hmm.
normal thing to do. So sometimes I've learned, like, taking ownership a little bit of it, and naming it has helped. But I've experienced things like, I can remember a period in time where Instagram would take down my selfies, because, like, or photos with my face in it, because it was unsuitable for, like, it goes against community guidelines or whatever it says. Yeah, I went through a lot of time of that. And at the time, this was like maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and people weren't very understanding. And I if I said anything about that, like, I might have put a Facebook status saying, I'm really upset because my photos of my face have been taken down from social media. And there were still people who would be like, well, it's your own fault for doing that. It's your own fault. Like, you should be hiding away. It's not appropriate that people see things like that. And but I'm like, it's my face. It's how it is. Like, I'm not posting pictures of, like, fresh self-harm wounds. That would be inappropriate. But healed scars, they're part of me. They're part of who I am. They're part of my journey. They're part of who built me, what built me into who I am today. And yeah, I regret a lot of that, but they're there, and there's nothing I can do about it. I can either accept them or not accept them. So accepting them is a part of that, is showing my face to
Yep.
people.
Yeah. And
Who kind of,
representation is so important. People need to see this. We don't live in la la land. People have their struggles, people have their conditions, people are going to look different, and I think
yeah,
it's vitally important that people see that. And this idea of um moderating that content and taking that content down, I think is absolutely ridiculous. And as you say, it wasn't a fresh cut; it's a scar, and a lot of people have scars, so that's really um, concerning to hear about Instagram taking things down. Is that being improved upon, or is that still the case now?
It's not something I've experienced in the more recent past. I think maybe they've got a slightly better way of managing it now than it might have been quite an automatic thing in the past. I'm not sure. I'm not gonna lie, I don't use Instagram as much. It's not my favorite platform, partially because of that. That it just sort of like it because it's visual based. It can be quite discriminatory
Mhm.
because of that. Um, so yeah, that has put me off using that sort of social media. But in real life, I think I've learned a lot about owning my scars. Something that was really helpful for me was um, when I was in the burns unit. The day after the incident, the staff were like, "Come on, we're going out. We're going off the ward, and we're going into the hospital. Like you're not going to be hiding away." And I hated them for it. I absolutely hated them for it because at that point my face was very swollen. Like my head was half one side of my face was like twice the size. It was really not a not pleasant thing to see, and I hated them for making me do that. But I'm so grateful now. Like yeah, within a couple of days they'd worked it up to me being someone would take me down, leave me maybe in a coffee shop to have a coffee, and then come back and get me. So I was getting used to being there alone. It meant when I left the hospital and went out into the real world, that was difficult because in a hospital, people are expecting people to look a bit funny, maybe, but in the real world, they're not. But it did just give me that bit of confidence to just like to not hide away. Um, and another thing that I found really helpful was like the information from Changing Faces around like dealing with people staring. One of them was like, if people are staring at you, like make eye contact back to them. And 9 times out of 10 people look away. And it made me feel like I had lasers for eyes. Um, I felt like quite powerful. Just sort of like, yeah, like people would either look away or maybe I would, if they were being appropriate about it. Some people weren't. I had a lot of people shouting and that horrible stuff. I had this one man who was shouting across the tram and then came to sit and stare at me and stuff. And the tram conductor had to move him away. I wasn't going to entertain him with any sort of conversation. It wasn't appropriate. But other people were just genuinely. People don't know what they're seeing when they see a visible difference. They kind of they worry what might have happened to that person, and part of it is just like, I don't know what I'm seeing here, and that's why people stare. So sometimes if I'm in the right place and that person is being kind of appropriate with it, I might let them. I probably won't let them know it was self-harm. That's not something I'm comfortable with doing just randomly out and about, but I might let them know this is a burn scar. Or I quite often had parents shielding their children. Like kids will stare; it's a normal part of being a child. They will stare, and parents will be like, "You can't stare at that woman. You can't stare at that woman." And I'd be like, "No, it's okay. They can have a look and they can ask a question if they want." And usually the kid would just be like, "What's that on your face?" And I'd be like, I've just had a like you might fall down and cut your knee. I've got an injury to my face, but it's healing and I'm going to be okay." And they were like, "Okay, that's fine." They just want to know that you're going to be okay sometimes.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and for anyone listening, it's especially if you have a visible difference, it's very much a learned skill. So,
Mm,
like, Ellie's worked a lot, I imagine, on being confident in this and being able to do that, and being able to answer questions and say, I've got scars on my face. Do you want to ask a question? You don't flick a switch and just learn to do
no,
that. So if you're in that position where you feel incredibly self-conscious or embarrassed, or you're struggling, don't worry. It's a process and it's a journey, and it's one that I'm very much still on. I'm not always in the place where I can
yeah,
handle those situations very well at all. Sometimes you're in that mode, and doing this work has helped a little bit because I kind of feel it like it's almost part of my job now to try and educate people.
Yeah, I'm the same in that my job is around is a lived experience role in mental health. So my job is to educate people around that. So it does help, I think, when you make this sort of your line of work in some way. But it's also, yeah, it's a learning curve and it's up and down. I don't and not every day I feel like that. Like when we started this call, I had my hood up because I was having a difficult day and I didn't fancy being seen in any way. And that like is probably a fairly normal thing. I think for someone with a visible difference is probably a bit more accentuated. But sometimes you just don't feel like you can manage it, and that's okay as well. It doesn't mean you've like gone backwards. It's just we all have up and down days.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. Do you mind if I ask, because you're in hospital currently and have been
Hmm.
for a little while now,
Yeah.
do you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah, so as I've mentioned before, I've got complex mental health problems and an eating disorder, and uh, I, because of that, I've not been able to live independently for like a number of years. I have full time care at home, and I was admitted to hospital last September because my eating disorder had relapsed, and unfortunately, around that, a lot of other things were going on as well, and my care at home fell through, and so I've kind of got stuck in hospital, waiting for care to get sorted out, and it's been very complicated, basically like too unwell for various options and too well for other options, and kind of it's constantly, oh no, that's your problem, that's your problem. So I've kind of stuck in that situation. I am still trying to recover from my eating disorder. I'm kind of in a better place physically, but not necessarily mentally. And I don't think I can get any better mentally in a hospital environment. But yeah, I'm there because of my eating disorder, but kind of held by my complex mental illness at the moment. So yeah, I'm on a medical ward. I'm not on a psychiatric ward. So it's hard. It's not an ideal place to be living for a long period of time.
Yeah, I
It's
can imagine. Yeah, I've got there's a lot of autism in my family, and
Mhm.
so we know about the care game a little bit. You know, this trying to get arrange care, and
Yeah,
it can be very difficult for sure. I
yeah.
think a lot. Sorry, go on.
They want you to fit into boxes that are
Hmm.
pre-planned, and most people don't fit into pre-planned boxes, and
Hmm.
yeah, it can be really frustrating.
I think people's only kind of exposure to a psychiatric ward is through films,
Hmm.
essentially. Do you mind talking about the realities of life on a psychiatric ward?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I'm not on a psychiatric ward at the
Hmm.
moment, but I have
Hmm.
been on
Yeah.
many in my time. I Yeah, I think prior to me having gone into a psychiatric ward, I think I'd seen Girl Interrupted, and that was my only sort of vague idea of what it might be like. Um, all the depictions we see are American for a start, which is and the American psychiatric system is very, very different to the British one. Um, there's a lot more choice for them. Often they kind of choose to check themselves into a psychiatric institution, whereas a majority of the people, definitely in this city, a majority of the people will be detained under the Mental Health Act, so they are actively not choosing to be there, which definitely makes a difference to how the dynamics are on the ward. Um, yeah, so being in a psychiatric ward is there's this misconception that you might be going in and having a rest, and you'll get therapy, and like everything will like get all sorted out, and you come out in the new you or whatever. That's exactly the opposite to what happens. A large majority of acute psychiatric wards are not therapeutic environments. There's inherently a lot of restricted practices going on, whether that's that the doors are locked, whether that there's restraints, the use of like sedative medication. Usually there's not therapy as well, so you're quite often just kind of there, just being, trying to survive each day. If you're lucky, there might be occupational therapy groups or things like that, but very little psychological like one-to-one therapy. And they're noisy places, they're scary places as well. Are like I've had a lot of difficult situations. I'm quite a small built female, and all the wards that I've been on had been mixed wards as well, and there might be some really very unwell, very big guys, and that physically is very scary.
Mhm.
And like, think things can happen, and staff turnover is very fast as well. Staff are burnt out, so it's all everything's just quite chaotic, and they're not therapeutic places at all. They serve a purpose, maybe to sort people's medication out to keep them safe in an immediate crisis. Though that's not always the case. My incident with fire setting happened on a psychiatric ward. I have had friends who have died on psychiatric wards as well. They're very difficult places to be. And not the answer. I do hear a lot of people who maybe are struggling with mental health problems who kind of want to be admitted to hospital because they think that people are going to kind of take everything off their hands and make it better, and that's not necessarily the case. There are places that are more therapeutic. I've been to a therapeutic community, which was a very specific uh, place aimed at women with the same sort of diagnoses and problems as I had, and it was a therapeutic program that lasted a year. That was actually life changing for me. But that's the only time I've had of being in hospital where it's been like a therapeutic intervention. I think often real recovery happens in the community, like in
Mhm.
alongside your actual life.
Mhm. No, thank you for that. Yeah, I had no idea at all. Yeah, I assumed it was somewhere you would go and have intensive therapy, and they would,
Mm.
try and, for lack of a better word, fix you, I suppose. But yeah, it sounds like a just a place to kind of try and keep you safe and
Mm.
have a little bit of maybe a little bit of a reset. That sounds pretty scary.
Yeah, it's a bit of a holding place. A large amount of the people there are kind of being assessed as to what's actually going on, and then actually any treatment that's going to happen will happen after that.
I was having a flick through your blog, and at one point, just a very quick question. You mentioned there's a significant difference between a compulsion and an
Mhm,
impulsion. Would you
mhm.
mind explaining that, please?
Yeah, so I think I touched on this earlier. So uh, a a lot of people presume that all self harm is impulsive. So an impulsive action being something that kind of like, in the spur of the moment, in the spur of big emotions, you do X, Y, Z. Um, uh, Whereas a compulsive action tends to be much more like slow burning, I guess. It tends to be it, like something that like kind of like builds on time and becomes like an itch that you need to scratch. And that may or may not be accompanied with like obsessive thoughts. So um some people can experience those in a more sort of like obsessive compulsive disorder way, where like if I don't do action, like this bad thing will happen. So yeah, like I don't know, like it could be that if I don't turn the door handle several times to check it's locked, that my children will die. That they don't always, like, they're not, that's not technically connected in any way, like, but in that person's mind it kind of becomes connected. So you can get compulsive kind of compulsive thoughts without the obsessive aspect of it, and you can get obsessive thoughts without necessarily having a compulsion to complete. But it's a very different area of your brain, how your brain's working, than those impulsive, like, uh, spur of the moment. We've all had that, where someone said something and it's made you really angry and you've thrown your phone across the room, like in a kind of impulsive fit of like of rage. And that for some people can be how they end up self-harming. And I have had that in the past. That when I first started self-harming, it was probably more along those lines. But actually, for me, there's a lot of like complex stuff, a lot to do with trauma, that's kind of all building and in the background of it. And so they tend to be more compulsive things that are like, yeah, they like build over time. But it's that thing of like, if I don't I can't not do this, I can't not do this compulsive thing.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, my mum's trained as a therapist. She's in her 5th year now studying. And I know she's going to find all this really, really interesting and
Yeah.
really helpful. Yeah, thank you for that. I feel like one of the things I love about this podcast is that I just get to learn so much, and I try and do my research beforehand, but like not go too deep because I want to learn in the conversation. And
Yeah.
it's great to be able to get an insight into other people's lives and the things they have to deal with. And it's funny how certain things that I have to deal with that I think everyone knows, but people just don't because they don't have to live with it. And so a lot of this stuff is probably completely common sense to you, but
Yeah,
for
yeah.
but for everyone else, it's
It's like,
it's it's
whoa,
interesting to
mind
learn.
blown.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, I think compulsive behaviors, there's a lot of connections between like autism and neurodiversity as well with compulsive behaviors, and kind of needing things to be in a certain way. Maybe eating disorders often as well. There's like a lot of link between that.
We kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, and you were talking about the difficulties you've had with the NHS. So you were previously diagnosed with borderline personality
Hmm.
disorder, which I believe made it a lot more difficult to get the care that you needed. But then when you were diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, you found things a little bit easier. Would you mind explaining the difference between the two, and then maybe a little bit about why you found it easier now?
Yeah, apologies for the lorry
Is it a
reversing in
bin
the
lorry?
background. If you can hear that.
It's all
Um,
right. It's authentic. People
yeah,
like
the authentic
authentic.
hospital noises. Um, yeah, so um I was in the mental health system, like under eating disorder services only to start with, but was struggling a lot with a lot of other things, and kind of was really frustrated because I felt like I was engaging well with treatment and trying really hard, but there was still something missing that that kind of wasn't getting any better. I was admitted to a psychiatric hospital just over 10 years ago now. The psychiatrist sat down with me, and actually I was quite lucky that my diagnosis of borderline personality disorder was done in quite a collaborative way, which is not often the case. You hear a lot of people sort of finding out that they've got this diagnosis because they've read their notes upside down on someone's desk or something like that. uh, yeah, it's a complicated diagnosis to receive in that sort of sense, but for me, he was like, I think what you're experiencing might be uh it might come under sort of the umbrella of borderline personality disorder, which I had heard of, but I didn't really know what it was. I thought it was something to do with like multiple personalities. The term borderline personality disorder comes from historically the thought that the person who was suffering from the illness was on the borderline between psychosis and neurosis.
Okay.
So that's where the term comes from. It's also often now known as emotionally unstable personality disorder. They are basically the same thing. It's just two different diagnostic manuals use a different name. Um, but he was like, he gave me some information about it that actually had been written by a woman who works for the trust that I work for, who has borderline personality disorder, and like her experiences of being diagnosed with it and living with it. And he said, go away and look at this, and we'll meet in a week's time. And if it fits, we'll run with that. If it feels like we're barking up the wrong tree, then we're barking up the wrong tree. And I went away and read it and thought, oh my god, this this explains a lot. I'm not just a failure at recovering from my eating disorder. Like there's other stuff going on. So initially, it felt quite a helpful thing. I was like, oh, I'm not going mad. I'm not a failure. Like there's a reason behind this. But that kind of honeymoon period, I guess, very quickly wore off as I discovered that actually having that diagnosis shuts a lot of doors for you in services. So, borderline personality disorder probably comes with one of the most heavy stigmas of any psychiatric disorder, specifically within healthcare services. There's a lot of misconceptions about it. There's a lot of presumption that the people are behaving the way they do because they are attention seeking, because they want to manipulate people. There's a lot of presumption that people are resistant to change, resistant to treatment, and um, you get really negative sort of views or presumptions, and a lot of people, something like over 80%, probably more than that, over 80% of people with borderline personality disorder actually have a history of trauma. But 9 times out of 10 people are refused trauma therapy because they have a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. So you get people who have, like, you know, maybe lived a very traumatic upbringing, not had the luxury of learning how to regulate their emotions, learning, you know, how to interpersonally interact with other people, not learning those sort of things that you might learn if you have a sort of more linear life. And then they're also, as an adult, being met with this sort of a similar sort of set of chaotic responses from services, like, you can't have this treatment because of that, you're doing that for attention, and all of these sort of presumptions that close so many doors, and it just further sort of compounds like trauma that people have. It's a really big problem, and I found that the same was happening to me. I am one of the lucky ones that as I mentioned before, I went to a therapeutic community for a year that was for women with borderline personality disorder. The reality was, actually, when I got there, I found out that everybody had complex trauma and other things like that going on. And actually, I don't think there's anyone that I was with on the unit now that carry the borderline personality disorder diagnosis anymore. They've all had their diagnoses changed since then, myself included. So about 3 years ago, I sat down with a different psychiatrist, and we talked through more things. He was like, tell me things. I understand that you might not be able to tell me everything, and just because you haven't told me doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Because one of the things that I'd struggled with is people, like, it became clear that I did have trauma, and I was diagnosed with PTSD, but I'd have, like, psychiatric nurses saying, "Oh, because you haven't told us about this XYZ traumatic thing, then it can't have actually happened," sort of thing, because you've only chosen to tell us now, not 10 years ago. And why would I tell someone when I first met them that I've had this traumatic thing that I can't even say the words myself about? So he was really understanding that, you know, I might be holding a lot of things that I'm not able to explain to people. And he was like, you can draw it, you can do an interpretive dance if you need to, whatever. And so we had this conversation, and he went away and he spoke to various other colleagues, and came back and did sort of, I'd gathered a lot of diagnoses over the years, including borderline personality disorder, but he kind of, like, I guess, wiped the slate clean and was like, okay, so we're going to roll with it. You have complex PTSD and you have anorexia. And that has, it was a complicated process for me. I kind of was initially I felt like listened and heard and validated for what I'd been through. But then, actually, I've also been through 10 years of my life with this diagnosis that's hugely shaped where things have gone for me, and whether I've got help or whether I've been in hospital, all of these sort of things. And with that becomes all the stigma and the self stigma as well that I carry a lot of, like, internalized stigma. And it wasn't just a case of, boom, this is your new diagnosis, that's all gone. It was quite a journey for me personally to like have that diagnosis changed, and what does that mean to me? Do I forget that diagnosis? But actually, it shaped my life for the last decade. So that's something that I've talked about on a national level at national conferences around that, like, aspect, because it is something that is becoming more common, that people are sitting down and reconsidering. People who've been given the BPD diagnosis because it's kind of a catch-all. It covers a lot of things, diagnosis, and actually a lot of people are autistic and that's not been seen. They have OCD and that's not been seen. They've got complex post-traumatic stress disorder and that's not been seen. But yeah, so I do a lot of speaking about that, and how that process can affect someone and how it can change their lives afterwards. So he did say, when he re-diagnosed me, he was like, I can re-diagnose you, but I can't get rid of stigma that might be already there, because people who've known you for 10 years and known you with this diagnosis, they're still probably going to have that stigma. But actually, I was kind of pleasantly surprised that a lot of people fully agreed with him. And I have found that 9 times out of 10, I'm met with a lot more compassion than I was before. There is an understanding that the way I behave, like why that might be, and that it's not attention seeking or manipulative or whatever that is. And that's been great in terms of I feel so much more understood. And things like crisis intervention and stuff is so much more effective now because they're working with me as a person rather than like pushing me away because I have BPD. But it also makes me really sad. I'm the same person. My experiences haven't actually changed at all. I'm the same person. It's just someone's changed the letters that are attached to me, and how different I'm treated. That makes me really sad. That people can get so caught up on a diagnosis that they don't see the person.
I don't think I've ever nodded so excessively talking to
Yeah, there was
someone,
a lot of
but you
nodding going
you
on.
talk so well. I'm so grateful that you step forward, and you do the advocacy work, and that you do these big national talks, because your voice, you speak so eloquently for your community, for our community. So thank you so much. I think if there's any healthcare professionals listening, this is a very oversimplified way of saying it. Please be one of the good ones.
Mhm.
We've all had we've all had experiences with the negative ones, and and it can absolutely hang you out to dry for decades. And then all of a sudden you get in front of a good one. And by being a good one, the first step is just being really empathetic,
Mm,
listening, and just really, you can tell when a healthcare professional is really engaging their brain and really looking at the situation, and not just trying to almost get you out the door. They're really trying to break things down, and that when you get that person, it completely changes your life. So if you're
absolutely.
listening, please be one of the good.
Yeah. Yeah, make your own make your own decisions as well. Like you're dealing with people first and foremost. You're not dealing with diagnoses, as you're dealing with human beings. And I always, in all my trainings, I encourage people to try to get to know that person as a person. Well, they probably, this person isn't just coming along as diagnosis. They're a person. They might be a father, they might be a daughter, they might have a job, they might do this hobby, they've got a history. Like just like learn about them as a person, and don't make your own judgments. I think it's really common for teams to, you see quite often really enthusiastic young graduate nurses like being like, I'm going to change the world, yay. And then they, like, within 6 months they're ground down by negative cultures in teams. And it can be really hard to speak against that grain, but the more people that do stick by what they are seeing and experiencing rather than what they're hearing
Hmm.
from other people, the more people that do that, the more things will change, and it becomes easier for the professionals as well as for the people
Hmm.
living with it.
Yeah, and if you're around that negative team, just know that from the patients, we love you. So
Yeah.
please, for
Yeah.
us, keep the faith and keep going. Definitely.
Yeah.
Just to go back a little bit to talk about. So you mentioned it seems to be a recurring theme. This thing you keep facing of people essentially victim blaming you, saying it's self-inflicted, attention seeking, blah blah blah. And I read that it took you 8 years to reach out for support for your burns because of
Mm.
that. So that those accusations, whatever you want to call them, have very real um, implications. But then you reached out to Dan's Fund for Burns and had quite a
Yeah.
positive experience. Would you be happy to talk about that?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. So yeah, as I've mentioned before, there's a lot of internalized stigma that I carry around a whole aspects of myself. But one of those, yeah, in particular, was around the burns. As I mentioned before, I set myself on fire. It was a self-inflicted thing, and I struggled with the not only the physical aspect of that, but the psychological aspect of that, and I wasn't given any help for that. After the incident happened, and it's grown into a massive disabling thing in my life. My PTSD stops me from doing a lot of things that people just take for granted. Um, and I've kind of always felt like, yeah, well, because it's my own fault, because I did it myself, I can't possibly you know ask for help with that. definitely not. I had heard of Dance Fund for Burns, but I was like, oh, it's, you know, they're not going to help me, because most people with burns, it's happened by accident, or even worse, someone else has done it to them. It's not their fault. It's all my fault. And it wasn't until the burn on my face that I mentioned, which happened in 2023, so 2 years ago now. Sorry, I'm losing track of time.
Yeah, I'm the same. Don't worry.
2 years ago, that I started to like I was supported more by the burns unit, and by my mental health team after that, and I started to understand a little bit more that maybe it wasn't entirely my fault. Yes, it was the action that I did, but there was various things that led up to that. And the burns unit had encouraged me to reach out for Dance Fund for Burns, and I'd kind of like, I'd be like, no, it's not. They're not going to help someone like me. And then it was literally a kind of one Wednesday evening, I realized that it was the Dance Fund for Burns. Like, they have a weekly online chat, and I was like, oh, you know what? Okay, I'm going to go on it, because I don't have to. It's just an online thing, so like a typing thing, so I can not say anything if I don't want to. And I was sitting there and watching this chat, and people were talking about problems that I have, like, every day, that I can't talk to anyone about like stuff to do with burns care things. People talking about pressure garments and skin grafts and all of this sort of stuff that I'm very alone with in my life, let alone all the PTSD aspect of it. And I kind of felt like, even in that situation, I felt like I'd still be alone with my PTSD. But then someone had mentioned something that they couldn't do because of anxiety after their fire, and I was like, oh my god, me too. And so I started joining those chats, and they have a Zoom one as well. And it took me a while, but I eventually did say why I was there, and people didn't turn around and be like, get out, you're not supposed to be here. It was quite the opposite. People were just like, okay, like, and yeah, what's going on for you now? And like, and I got the opportunity to go on the Dance Fund for Burns Adult Burn Survivors Weekend in September 2023. I went down to Surrey with my carer, and I remember just being like, no, I can't do this. I can't do this. Like, it might, you know, it might be all right online, but I haven't really told people what's going on. And like, you know, if no one's going to accept me. And I got there, and I said to my carer, like, we need to go. We need to go. I'm not supposed to be here. I like, and she was like, no, stick it out. And we did the first evening, and like, everyone was lovely. And I was really surprised that people were really like open about burns. They were like, hi, I'm so and so. I've got X percentage of burns. My house exploded, or this happened. And I was just like, whoa, okay. People don't shy away from talking about this here in the mental health world. Talking about self-harm is very taboo, or scars is very taboo. But in the burns world, everyone is just like really upfront about it. And I was like, this is kind of refreshing. So I was able to say to people, oh yeah, no, I'm Ellie. I've got burns on my face and my torso, but I didn't, I couldn't bring myself to say what had actually happened. And the next morning there was like an open mic thing, and people got up and told their stories, and these stories were, oh my god, I can't even explain. It was such a privilege to be in that room, to hear people's stories. Like, they were raw, they were honest, they were tragic, they were funny, every emotion was there in that room. Some people, you know, they'd been involved in massive incidents that made international news, like a huge percentage of burns and really long recoveries. Some people had like a hot water bottle explode on them at home that no one else knew about, but had affected their life hugely, and everything in between. And I was, again, still sitting there being like, I feel really privileged to be in this room, but I shouldn't be here. I'm not supposed to be here because I did this myself. And I don't even know how it happened, but I ended up, there was a gap, and they were like, is anybody else want to take the microphone? And I found myself getting up and standing there at the front. And I honestly, I don't remember anything past the beginning where I said, I don't know if I should be here, because unlike a lot of you, I chose to do this myself. And then I told my story in a very garbled way that I don't I don't really fully remember, and I was in tears for most of it. And like, I finished and went to sit down, and was literally, I honestly 100% was expecting people to turn around and be like, get out, she shouldn't be here.
Get her.
And like, I honestly thought that was going to happen. And exactly the opposite. Like that, it was a massive turning point in my life. Like, Polly, who runs Dance Fund for Burns, like got up and took the microphone and said, everybody deserves to be here, every one of you deserves to be here. And the woman who was sat behind me, like, gave me a hug from behind, and several people like held my hand as I went past, and the guy who was sitting next to me turned to me and said, oh, that was so brave, well done. And then someone else went and got up and said, I wasn't going to get up and tell my story, but Ellie's just told her story, so honestly, I feel like I can too. And he was like, I feel that my burns were self-inflicted and I feel guilty for it. He'd got quite a different story to me. It was kind of accidental, but he hadn't put the fire out because of the dark place he was in. And he told his story too. And during the weekend, several more people came up and said that they felt guilty for their burns as well. And it was just such a turning point, like that weekend, and that burn survivor community accepting me and accepting what I'd done started the process of me accepting what I'd done. And to be able to move forward from something, the first thing you need to do is accept it's happened. And that was a huge turning point in my life. And since then, Dan's Fund it's just been an absolute lifeline. It's a group of people who just get it. They have similar burns problems. I started growing leg hair on my skin graft and was freaking out about it a little bit. I've got leg hair on my face, and I messaged some of my burns friends, and someone was like, I've got pubes on my hand, mate, like it's normal. Like you know, it's that sort of thing. It's the like understanding, like understanding when things are difficult. Like at the Burn Survivors weekend, loads of people had things that they couldn't do. There was quite a few people who were anxious about, which I hadn't thought about because my burns are nothing to do with hot water, when we were like getting tea and coffee and there was like one of those hot water geyser things, and some people were anxious about it. And other people were like, here, I'll just get your cup for you. Like, no, people just accepted that everybody sort of like had stuff going on, and it was fine. It was fine. You just accepted. Yeah, I really would encourage people to reach out to charities like that, like an absolute lifeline where the NHS isn't maybe able to
Yeah.
to do that sort of thing.
I
Yeah,
couldn't
and
agree
like,
more. Yeah, such an
yeah,
amazing story. And yeah, I couldn't agree more. I was always very much like march or die. I just need to keep going. You know, it doesn't matter about, you know, just downplay. But then going into these groups of people with other visible differences, it just feels so freeing and so lovely.
mm,
So I totally agree that, yeah, please do reach out, because being around people with similar experiences, it almost feels like just a lovely break, like a lovely reset of having a little bit of
yeah,
time of socializing and not having to have all those anxieties. Something I keep noticing with talking to people in the visible difference community is that I think because we're often a little bit dismissed, and, you know, so for example, I'll have things said to me like, "Oh, it's just a rash. Why are you making a big deal?" Or
mm,
my friend Dan, he's got a scar, and it's, "Oh, it's just a scar. What are you making a big deal?" I think that starts to infect you a little bit, and you
yeah,
start to
yeah, it
believe
does.
it, and you start to be like, "Oh, I don't need help. I don't need." You know, any assistance, because it's just a rash, because it's just a scar, because it's just a whatever. But those people who are, you know, throwing those comments out of you don't understand the real world. Um,
The psychological impact of living with
yeah,
anything like that.
yeah, exactly,
Mm.
exactly. So don't basically, yeah, try not to let that infect you. These people, these dismissive people who don't understand your story, don't let their remarks get in your head, because it's flipping hard to deal with the visible difference, and there's no shame whatsoever in reaching out for some help and trying to find your people, as your story
Yeah,
showed.
it's
Yeah.
like find your gang. And like, I think one thing is, like, I think a lot of what affects people with visible difference is that people are scared. People are scared of visible difference. And the more we tell our stories, the less scared people become. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. When I first walked into the Burns weekend, there's a lot of people with like quite significant injuries, and you start being like, oh my god, what's happened, and it does make you anxious. But as soon as people start telling their stories, like it breaks down that sort of barrier, and that fear that I think adds to people's stigma towards people with visible difference. One thing that I really enjoyed from that weekend is we were staying in this hotel, and it was it was closed to everyone else, but the restaurant was still open. So there were a couple of like people wandering around using the restaurant, and it was just fantastic because for one, we were all used to being the person in the room that people stare at because we look different. And for once, we were the majority. And there was these couples going for their romantic meal, like surrounded by all these scarred people, like feeling quite uncomfortable because they were in the minority. And it was so empowering to have an opportunity to not be the ones that was being looked at.
Yeah, definitely. As I say, it's an awesome feeling. So if you've never experienced that, just give it a try. Just reach out to your local group and just give it a try. Maybe it won't help you, but I think it will. And just go to one meeting and see how you get on. Yeah,
got a lot of time for charity spaces.
So you've been going to the British and Irish Group for the Study of Personality Disorders for a while now, which is Big SPUD, which is the best acronym I've ever heard. I think it's an important place for people to learn about. Would you mind explaining about it a little bit, please?
Yeah, it is a great acronym. I haven't seen any giant potatoes there, though. I'll let you know if I do come across it. I've been going to Big SPUD since 2018. It is a very large conference, sort of 600 delegates, I think, at this point, but also with a lot of like online presence and external presence as well as a lot of people who kind of watch the conference who aren't physically there, and it's basically people coming together and speaking about personality disorders and the associated things that come with it. So increasingly that has been talking a lot about trauma and trauma informed practices and person-centered care and things like that. I'm not going to lie, this was another case of internalized stigma. When I first went to the conference, I was not that long out of the therapeutic community. I'd taken I'd done a kind of like little service user survey around the impact of activity in borderline personality disorder recovery, and I'd taken it as a poster presentation, and I was very much like, no one's going to want to hear what I'm just someone with BPD, a patient, no one's going to want to hear what I want to say. And I nearly didn't go, and I went in the end and got highly commended for my poster. Ended up making so many connections, realizing that there are people that really do want better for people with personality disorder, and again, that was another turning point for me. It like kind of led me to what I'm doing today in terms of lived experience work and research and education, and it's a really good space for combating that stigma, like thinking of better ways that we can practice that take into account people's experiences, people's trauma. It's also there's a very strong lived experience sort of strand of the conference. About 20% of the people there are people either like with lived experience or working as lived experience practitioners, and there's not really another place where we can gather like that. So that for me, definitely working in a lived experience role in the NHS, where originally when I started my role over 6 years ago, I was the only person who wasn't a peer support worker working in a lived experience role in my trust, and it was very, very isolating. But having this sort of, again, it's that finding your group of people, and the Big SPUD is some of my group of people, having all this network of people who are also working in similar roles in different varieties of services, charities, NHS trusts over the UK, has been a really massive part of supporting me through work, and I support other people as well.
What does that role entail, the lived experience practitioner?
Yeah, so I mean, I say lived experience practitioner as quite an umbrella term to cover. It could cover peer support workers, it could cover like peer educators, it could cover like lived experience leads, anything. There's all sorts of roles now coming out in that have lived experience at their core. So I work in the NHS as a lived experience research ambassador. So my role is around co-production in research and service user involvement in research. But I'm not talking about just taking part in research or maybe being wheeled out to give your opinion on something before we wheeled away again. I'm talking like we want people to be designing the research, to be delivering the research. Like, for example, doing a research interview. If you've got a service user being interviewed by an academic or a professional, that's an imbalance straight away, and you're probably not going to get a very sort of a truth, a full rich idea of what's going on, because they're going to be slightly guarded. Whereas in our trust, we've started training up lived experience research interviewers, so they're people who are also going, maybe using services, living with mental health problems, and they're having that like peer-to-peer conversation, and the the richness of data that we can get from that is so much better. And having research designed by people with lived experience for people with lived experience means that, like, we're actually researching the right things in the right way, rather than just what some professors locked in some university tower think that we should be looking at.
They can get a bit
And yet,
blinkered, can't they, for sure?
yeah, and there's definitely, sometimes it's really things that, again, what we've just been talking about, it feels really obvious to us, to us living with those. It feels really obvious, but it's not necessarily. So, for example, I'm part of a bigger project to do with looking at physical activity and severe mental illness, and one of the ways that they wanted to track whether people got more physically active after doing the intervention was to use like activity trackers. But they were talking specifically about people with schizophrenia, bipolar, psychosis. And I was like, well, what about, a lot of these people are going to have like kind of concerns around being monitored, about being tracked, and you're expecting them to wear a device that's tracking what they're doing. And they were like, oh no, well, it won't tell them what they're doing, it'll just relay it straight to us. And I was like, even worse. Like, can we not think about another way of doing this? And actually, this was way back when I wasn't as confident about having my thoughts put forward, so I kind of left it there. Lo and behold, we get to the point where we're doing the feasibility part of the trial, so we're testing out whether or not our intervention and the way we're researching it is going to work when we do the big trial across the country. And one of the problems was lack of adherence to wearing the physical activity trackers. So they're doing this intervention, but they can't get the data as to whether it's actually working for people. And we've had to stop and start and think about it again. But actually, if we'd just done that at the beginning, we wouldn't have wasted all this time and money and delays. We would have just got it right from the start.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, a lot of my work is around that, and I also do a lot of work around education, teach and train like qualified professionals and also students. And I do a lot of work around service development as well, so getting lived experience, other people lived experiences, views sort of heard in how we and shaping develop our services.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
lots of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you mentioned in there about exercise, which I know
Mm-hmm.
is something that you feel quite strongly about from your
Yep.
blog, and you're a hula hooping, acrobating, roller skating, everything that's cool you seem to do. So have you found generally that that's really helped you? I know it's helped me. I feel like a lack of control in my symptoms, and I find that exercise and the gym gives me just a bit more of a feeling of control. I'm able to, I guess, kind of in a vain way, improve my appearance, and it's in my control. So I really enjoy exercise. I think it's something that's really, really important. I know that's kind of, everyone says that, but I genuinely think that it has real positive effects. Would you agree with that?
Like 100%. I mean, I was someone who was on an absolute cocktail of medication for years, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, antidepressants, all sorts of things. And I only started becoming more well when I came off those and was therefore able to engage with other things more. And one of those things was physical activity. And for me, being physically active, it serves so many purposes. One of the things it does is that, like, I am someone who struggles to regulate my emotions and things like that, but kind of getting it out in that positive way, helps me keep everything like kind of under control a little bit. Also, it's become something that like I kind of, I think we talked about this a bit with the like, you know, the feeling of euphoria maybe after self-harming, or for yourself after having a really good scratch. That gives you exercise gives you endorphins. It gives you that natural high without having to do something that's damaging to you. So that's another thing where it helps me. And it's been a reason to keep going, a reason to keep my body safe. I can't do these things if I'm not looking after my body. And it's also that feeling of achievement, like of you know, overcoming physical things that you didn't think you could do that before. Like I could never do a push-up, and I can now do plenty. Like that feels really cool. Or like the stuff I could do in skating, I would have never dreamed of being able to. I don't even know it existed. And it feels great. And it's a social thing as well. My social life revolves around being physically active. I don't even think about it's not a chore to me to, you know, when people are like, oh, I've got to go to the gym, or I feel it's just kind of a side effect of my social life at this point. Like, and for me as well, as someone who's been stuck in the mental health system a lot, it's allowed me to make friends and have a persona that's not just Ellie with the mental health problems. Yeah, people know about my mental health problems, because they're pretty hard to hide if you're around me for any period of time. But I've found in sports places that accept me despite that.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, it's another place to find a tribe, isn't it? When I used to go to the gym, I always wanted to just put my headphones on and just do my own thing. And then we went to a gym near us. It's kind of sort of like a CrossFit-y situation, but the community is just lovely. Everyone's so kind and everyone's so friendly, and it changes everything. And so it becomes your next little tribe. I'd say to anyone who is trying to get into exercise or being a bit more physical, try and find the thing you actually enjoy. You don't.
Yeah.
I absolutely despise running. I will not run. I hate it. So you don't have to go running. You don't have to do the things that you really hate. Find something you enjoy, and then it doesn't become a chore, like you say, and it just becomes
Yeah.
a massive positive around people that you around more friends. So yeah, I'd
Yeah,
agree.
like I started off with hula hooping, like I mentioned, and that was just we go and hang out in the park and hoop, and it was just nice. And I slowly got into other things, which then has meant that I became physically fitter, which then meant the things that actually I'd hated before, like running, actually became something that I was like, oh, I can do this now, and I actually quite
Yeah,
enjoy it. It just kind of like one thing's led to another, and yeah, the community is massive. Like, and if you're in a place where people are judging you, I've been to. For example, I can remember going to a yoga gym, and I had to say something about my access needs doing my PTSD, and they kind of turned around and said, "Oh, we don't think this is the right place for someone like you." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, you're right. If you're not willing to accept that, then you're not the right place for someone like me." And sometimes that can be really difficult, like not being accepted or being turned down, or there not being accessibility sort of adjustments that you need to be able to go there. But I'd just say that there's more places, there's different activities. Think outside the box. It doesn't have to be the gym, it doesn't have to be joining a football team. It can be roller skating, it can be gardening, it can be climbing, all sorts of things. Try somewhere else. If you don't feel accepted somewhere, yeah, there's other places that will accept you, but sometimes it does take a little bit of perseverance.
yeah, 100%. Think and be happy to think outside the box, like Ellie. Yeah, it doesn't have to be the normal stuff for sure. So the exercise is obviously very, very good advice for anyone. I've got a couple more questions for you. First question is, do you? This is a very general question, but do you have any practical advice for maybe anyone that's living with CPTSD, just generally?
Yeah, living with CPTSD is, I mean, it's complex post-traumatic stress disorder, for those that don't know, and um it's how it affects people is often quite varied, because we've all been through different experiences that have got us to that place. So one thing that might work for me might not work for someone else. But it's, I think there's very much a sort of give things a go. Like, I was very like avoidant of, so for example, for years I wouldn't do any sensory related stuff because I felt it was like babyish in some way, and I'm like, I'm an adult, I don't need any sensory stuff. And actually it turns out that's a massive part of why I struggle is sensory stuff, and whether that comes from neurodiversity or CPTSD or combination of both, I don't know, but it affects me. So actually when I started to like try those things out and test what worked, and again, a bit like I just said with the exercise, not everything's going to work first time, but give it a go and see what sticks. uh, yeah, just give things a go. You might be pleasantly surprised. I think a lot with living with CPTSD, a lot of it is about regulating our self within the world. Like, I used to get really, really angry at myself for reacting the way I did to various things. And now I think I'm understanding more that there's a reason why I react that way, that relates to how I might have been treated in childhood or whatever. And although the situation that I'm experiencing right now might not be that same situation, it's bringing up the feelings. And this is something I say when I'm delivering training to people and working with people with mental health. You don't necessarily have to understand what it is that like that person is, say for example, someone's come in and they've got psychosis and they're hallucinating or they're hearing or seeing things that you can't see are there. It doesn't really matter that you can't see them or you can tell that they're not true to you. What does actually matter is the feelings. And I'd say that's the same for someone struggling with anything, like not even just CPTSD, but anything. It's about the feelings. It doesn't matter if that thing seems like, I'm someone who like can't cope with tiny little things. Like the other day, there was no vegetables arrived for my tea, and I just like had a 2-hour meltdown. And it wasn't about the vegetables, but it's more about like for me, it's the feelings of that. It's the feeling of I'm going through a period of massive uncertainty in my life, and little things that are certain, like my vegetables turning up at tea time not happening, just adds to that feeling of uncertainty that I'm having in my wider life that I'm desperately trying to keep myself steady with. And so actually no wonder I found that really difficult and had a total meltdown. So it's about looking at the feelings that you and validating those feelings and dealing with the feeling rather than necessarily solving the problem or the trigger or whatever it is, because we can't always. The world is the way it is. The world, we can't control the world, but what we can control is how we respond to our own feelings.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Yeah, brilliant. Very last question. What are you hopeful for in the future? And that can be personally, that can be in mental health services, it can be in anything.
Um, I just hope that people continue to talk. I think this has been a big change since the pandemic, actually, that just in general people are more accepting that life is not linear, and life is not everything that it seems on the surface as well for people, and there is a lot more um acceptance that people struggle, and sometimes you need to take a mental health day, and like people are starting to think more about putting health and well-being first over the top of career or keeping up expectations. And so I just hope that we keep as a society like thinking about those things, yeah, and keeping
Yeah,
talking about it.
I totally agree. I was just speaking to a girl called Abigail Mara. I don't know if you know Abigail from Changing Faces.
Yeah, I've
And
seen
she
her
said
name.
she calls it a mopey day. So every now and
Yeah,
again you have to have
yeah,
a
yeah.
mopey day, and
A
that's
duvet
okay.
day,
Yeah.
mopey day, mental health day, whatever.
Absolutely, yeah, I totally agree. No, thank you so much for your time, Ellie. I have learned loads. I think like a lot of people in the visible difference community, some of us don't get enough recognition for what we're battling, just how hard it is we're going through. So, well done for keep battling through, and thank you so much for all the work you do. I think it's fantastic the way that you've turned a kind of a negative into a positive by sharing your message and sharing your story. It's something I'm hopefully trying to work towards a little bit. But yeah, thank you so much for your time.
No worries. It's been